In today's episode, we're going to dive into the fascinating world of intermittent fasting. We've all heard about the potential benefits of fasting, but what does the science really say? To help us unpack this, we're joined today by Dr. Stephen Anton, a professor, researcher, and author who has dedicated his career to studying the effects of intermittent fasting on our health, fitness, and longevity. Dr. Anton is an expert on various fasting methods, how fasting can boost brain health, support muscle building, and even strengthen the immune system. In this episode, we're going to explore fasting protocols, debunk common myths, and learn how you can start integrating fasting to your own health routine. Dr. Anton, welcome to the show. So, Dr. Anton, welcome to the show. Truly appreciate you being here. How's your day going?
Well, thanks for having me. It's been good for a Monday.
So you're down at the University of Florida.
Correct.
A little quick backstory, man. When I got out of undergrad, I was this close to going down to Gainesville, man. I was in the biomedical engineering program and they recruited me and I came down there. And to this day, the funniest part of the story is as soon as I got on campus, they took me straight to the stadium. It's like, oh, you got to see this first. I'm like, that's cool. You know, I'm not here to play football, right? But man, it was really cool kind of seeing that, man. Just a really cool campus and all that stuff. So, got a little mini Gator connection there, man. So tell me, how'd you get to University of Florida and how did you start this journey down this amazing path of intermittent fasting?
Oh, wow. Those are good questions, big questions in one. To answer the first question, how did I get to University of Florida? Well, when I was doing my undergraduate at another university that I don't talk about as much, but still a great university called Florida State University, I was torn between psychology and medicine and kept going back and forth until I got to a class called health psychology. And when I took that class, I had this epiphany that this is what I was meant to study because it was connecting our lifestyle or behavior with real medical outcomes. Up until then, I thought it was either medicine or psychology. And so then I said, I really want to learn more about clinical and health psychology, study the field of behavioral medicine, which led me to say, well, where's a great place to do that? And at the time, University of Florida, and still do, have one of the top programs in the country in clinical and health psychology. So that's how I initially came to the University of Florida for graduate school. I'll stop there and then follow up on your second question, give you a chance to say something.
No, it's great. It's great, man. It's good to know the journey of, I love asking people, like, how'd you get where you are, right? Because I always tell people that there's so many decisions we have to make to get to a certain point in life. I mean, how many thousands of decisions do you make in your life to get where you are, right? And there's always kind of like that moment where it's like, this is it.
Absolutely. And, the backstory as an undergraduate, not everybody knows exactly what they're going to do. Like I said, I switched majors like 3 or 4 times, and the true backstory, maybe another time I can give you what ultimately led me to pursue psychology. But just for time's sake, I'll just say that it was taking that class that led me to know that this is what I wanted to study, and gave me that inspiration, really.
Yeah. Okay. Sounds great. So psychology is the initial background.
Psychology, medicine, yeah, go ahead.
Right. So that being said, and this is like the cool part of the story, how'd you get from that? And we think psychology, we think counseling, therapy, you think all these great things like, hey, like how'd you get there into like, man, I'm going to be all this intermittent fasting thing, right? Because that's kind of a leap. Because again, if you think, I was like, oh man, I first heard about you and I was reading about you, like, oh man, this guy's got this nutrition, it's amazing, it's got this, doctorate in nutrition. And I was like, wait a minute, psychology, how'd this happen, right? And
yeah. Well, the great question, and I get it often. And so what I was alluding to was it's actually behavioral medicine or health psychology, which is really about our lifestyle related to exercise, sleep, diet, nicotine use, alcohol use, how all these fit together to influence our health and well-being. And so then to get into this, how did I get to intermittent fasting? That takes a little bit of a story. And so in grad school, my focus was on improving health through weight management, weight loss. And at the time, the obesity epidemic wasn't quite as much of an epidemic as it is right now, but it was becoming one. And so I became really fascinated with, okay, what do we do? What are our treatment options? And of course, calorie restriction was one of the major approaches, still is, for how do we help people. And so I had an opportunity to uh, complete a postdoctoral fellowship at a place called the Pennington Biomedical Research Center, which specializes in nutrition for metabolism, for obesity, for type 2 diabetes. And while I was there, I was involved in a study on calorie restriction for improving biomarkers of aging. This is all trying to get to the point of how did I get to intermittent fasting? Well, I was also involved in another study called Pounds Lost, looking at macronutrient composition and its effects on long-term weight loss. To speed up the process a little bit through these studies, through looking at the literature, over and over, there's this unfortunate pattern for the vast majority of people with calorie restriction that they lose weight initially, they follow it, but after about 6 months, you start to see adherence tailoring off and weight regain occurring. And so this calorie restriction approach that does have many benefits doesn't work for most people. And so that got me interested in what's an alternative approach that might produce similar benefits to calorie restriction and perhaps equally importantly is sustainable. And that's what initially got me interested in looking at the effects of intermittent fasting. To see, look in the literature, what do we know? Can it produce similar benefits? Can people follow it? Go ahead.
Yeah. No, I'm listening, right? Because again, it's just, and it's a great segue, right? Because I think what happens is a lot of times people will say, "Oh, I'm doing intermittent fasting," or "I'm fasting," but there's a little bit more specificity into the definition of that. So let's dive into it, man. Like, so what is intermittent fasting?
Great question. And first of all, I would say we all practice some form of intermittent fasting, no matter if you're, quote, practicing intermittent fasting or not, because almost all of us do not eat for long periods of time between our dinner meal and our breakfast meal. Now, for most people, that's less than 12 hours of time. And so one of the consensus accepted definitions of, quote, intermittent fasting is a period of 12 hours or longer without consuming calorie-containing drink or food. Exactly when you say this is now intermittent fasting is somewhat of a debate, but it's generally at least 12 hours and, of course, can be many days on end without food or drink.
Okay.
I say food or drink, that would be a specific type of fasting called dry fasting. Right now, we'll probably just focus on the typical type of fasting.
Yeah, it might better do that, man. Because again, it's just like, I know we have enough people. There's enough of a struggle just doing intermittent fasting with coffee, and we'll get into all that. So I guess that leads me into thinking about, okay, so basically you're voluntarily, not eating, right? So like, hey, I have this, so there's foods available, but you're not eating, you're taking this time period. We're going to get into the different types of intermittent fasting. But that being said, what's the purpose? Like, what's the goal of it? Like, what are we, and I guess that's kind of a broad question. We're getting into a lot of benefits of it and the different types of fasting. But when it comes down to it, what's the big picture purpose of recommending that someone do intermittent fasting?
Excellent question. So to backpedal a little bit, the reason that I think a lot of people initially got excited by intermittent fasting was because of the potential effects on body weight and in particular fat loss. And why that matters for obvious reasons. Most people, I would say in our country in particular, are interested in losing weight, but not just body weight. You want to lose the right type of weight. And what our review back in 2017 showed, and it seems to be the case, is that with the approach to intermittent fasting called time-restricted eating, that the proportion of weight loss is generally much higher percentage of body fat relative to lean tissue, which is what most everybody wants to achieve of fat loss and maintenance of lean tissue. So I would say the reason that a lot of people initially got excited by that approach was for weight loss, metabolic health benefits. Over the last decade, probably, or maybe 5 years in particular, we see that it's not just weight, but total body health at the cellular level can occur through consistent practice of intermittent fasting. And we can get into the cellular mechanisms, but essentially it has a positive effect on the biological mechanisms related to aging. So what we believe and what's been borne out in animal or preclinical studies is that it can actually extend our period of time when we're healthy, called our health span. So we're living better for longer periods of time, or it has the potential for that to happen, similar to exercise.
Okay, it's great. So that's actually, we're going to get all into the longevity piece of
Sure.
intermittent fasting. But I guess when we think about it, so when people say fasting, they'll say, okay, well, I'm going to do a fast, right? And there's, like you said, there's a water fast and there's a juice cleanse and all these different things, right? And so I guess where I'm kind of going with this is like, okay, when someone says they're fasting versus intermittent fasting, is it just more so the period of time, where it's like, hey, you know what? So I say, hey, I didn't eat yesterday.
Mm-hmm.
So I just technically I fasted, but then it's like if I go back to eating regularly, then it was just a fast. So if I'm understanding it right, so when intermittent fasting is like you're kind of going from this period of not eating, you have an eating window, you're not eating, and so there's more of a rhythm to it. Is that more accurate? That the difference between the
That's a
two?
great way to describe it. And what you're describing is what I think most people call intermittent fasting, which is a type of intermittent fasting called time restricted eating, where on a daily or almost daily basis, the period of time in which food is consumed is shortened. Probably the most popular form of time restricted eating is the 16-8, where for approximately 16 hours of the day you're fasting, um, and for 8 hours you have a eating window. But there's many different forms of time restricted eating. Could be 18-6, could be 24, could be 14-8. But that's time restricted eating is one form of intermittent fasting that's become more popular in part because of the consistency that you mentioned. There's also many other types like the 5-2 diet,
Oh
the
yeah, we're
alternate
gonna
day
get on to
eating.
that. I got
Yeah,
like a little list here. I got like a little menu
exactly.
of types of intermittent fasting I want to kind of go through and all this stuff. So that
Sure.
can help us kind of guide through it. And that was a great segue because the first one on my list is 16-8, right? And so, 16 hours of fasting, 8-hour eating window. So I guess the best way, that's big picture with it. But what are the benefits of that type of intermittent fasting, especially for someone who's just starting down that journey or path?
Well, it depends on goals. And so if the goal was for weight loss, it certainly could help with that because most people unintentionally eat about 300 calories less per day when they practice this type of approach. Um, what I think is probably the bigger benefit is it improves something called insulin sensitivity, which is our cells' ability, our responsivity to insulin, which means that when we consume food, it's much more likely to be utilized by our cells for energy instead of stored in our bloodstream. And having lower levels of glucose in our bloodstream is a good thing because that results in lower levels of inflammation. And by practicing fasting for approximately 16 hours a day, you also give your cells a chance to kind of clean out the waste products uh, through a process called autophagy. And that's a process that's been shown to be vital for our health. And so by activating that process or enhancing it is probably a better term, our cells start to function more efficiently, which means the mitochondria, the energy producing molecules within the cells, become more efficient. And by um, leading to the production of ketones, our body starts to run off a cleaner fuel source, which means we experience a little less oxidative stress. Our cells are under less stress, which ultimately results in better health for us. So I would say health and wellness, but also potentially improvements in body composition, assuming that the person eats sufficient macronutrients to maintain their lean mass. Yeah.
So I want to just tell you, Dr. Anton, that I on this podcast, we talk about longevity all the time. My patients,
Well,
we talk about longevity all the time. So, autophagy, senescence, metabolic inflammation. Don't feel,
oh,
don't
good.
hold back is where I'm
Great.
going. This is what
Okay. And
this is
I
what
didn't
we
even,
do.
that's
I,
great. Happy to hear
yeah,
that. I didn't even
yeah,
mention
yeah.
senescence, which is clearing out of cells that are clearly waste products at this point and are producing inflammatory cytokines all the time. And so the more you can clear those cells out, the better. So at
Right,
the end of the day, at the biological level, and one of the other mechanisms that I didn't even mention is potentially enhancing the production of stem cells in the body,
right.
which we all want more of generally as we age in particular.
Right. Yeah, we talk about the autophagies. Well, in many ways, I always think about autophagy as a process, where we think of senescence as kind of both a process and a problem. Where it's like you have these cells that are senescent, they're not dividing anymore, and they're giving off all these secretory, senescent associated secretory phenotypes. So they're just giving out inflammation. They're making other cells, pretty rowdy as well. And autophagy is one of the ways we can help clear these things out. So I think a lot of times, just like people are like, oh, well, I want to stimulate autophagy. Well, it's like, okay, well, that's great. But also you want to be mindful of the senescent phase as well. And and it depends, there's a lot of different supplements that target that process as well. And so we talk about this stuff all the time, man. Now,
Good. That's
that being
great.
said, now here's the big one. And we talk about this a lot in our longevity circles about how long will you see autophagy, those processes begin? How long do you need to fast to kind of get into a state where autophagy begins?
So if anybody can tell you exactly how long, I'd like to meet them.
Yeah.
But what I will say is for most people, it's related to what I've talked about called the metabolic switch, when your body switches from using glucose for energy to using ketones derived from your own body fat for energy. And when that switch occurs, it activates a whole series of pathways, including what I think is the autophagy pathway. And that switch generally starts to occur after anywhere from 12 at the early end, 12 hours to 16 hours or longer, depending on the person's state of metabolic health, their activity levels while fasting, their activity levels prior to fasting, their last night's food intake. So it's complicated to say exactly how many hours, but in general, probably at least 14 hours would start to get the process going in a metabolically healthy person.
Okay. So good amount of fasting, right? So you need to kind of you got to push yourself a little bit, right? To
Yeah.
get to that state.
And of course, longer is generally much better to start to see meaningful increases. Though, having said that, I think daily 16-8 or even 18-6 types of fasting would lead to enhanced autophagy compared to the typical eating pattern of most individuals.
Right, which makes sense. So, and I kind of got sidetracked a little bit, but circling back to that 16-8, are there any cons to it or any things that, hey, like where you wouldn't want to recommend that to a person?
So with any lifestyle change, there's always potential cons. The one, not the one, but one that comes to mind at the moment is if somebody, as a result of practicing 16-8, does not focus on their dietary intake during the eating window, ensuring that they're taking in adequate protein to maintain their lean body mass, there is the potential for loss of lean tissue to occur because of insufficient calories, insufficient protein. And that's why it's really important not just to focus on the fasting period, but also the eating period. And that's just a general thought. The other potential con would be somebody who tries to go to 16 hours too quickly. I think a lot of people hear 16 hours is, oh, that doesn't sound that hard. But if you've never fasted before, the last thing you want to do is push your body too quickly. It's similar to trying to exercise too much before your body's ready. It could result in headaches, dizziness, lightheadedness. And so I think the second con is don't undertake this level of fasting too quickly because it has that potential. A third potential con would be if somebody is kind of obsessive about calories and using it as a way to just really reduce caloric intake. And in general, the research doesn't suggest that this type of approach would lead to any sort of eating disorders. But if somebody has that tendency, I probably wouldn't advise this approach.
Okay. So something you said made me kind of think. You mentioned like, hey, in this window of time, people are not getting enough calories, right? And again, ensuring you eat enough calories is good for metabolic flexibility or just metabolism in general. But so with an 8-hour eating window, it seems like that shouldn't be that big of a problem, right? That's a pretty long window compared to some of the other modalities we're going to speak about.
Sure. Well, I think that's probably one of the reasons why 16-8 has become one of the most popular approaches, because it, like as you said, 8 hours is not so short that it's really that difficult to get calories. And for most people, it's enough time that they do consume adequate calories, adequate protein at the meals. You could get 3 meals within an 8-hour period, or you could do 2 meals. But I just say that as a potential caution, because sometimes in some circumstances with individuals we worked with, they just do not consume that many calories during the eating period, and as a result, yes, they lose weight, but the goal is not to lose lean tissue, especially as individuals age. So that's just a general caution. But as you mentioned, most people can consume adequate calories during that period.
Got it. I was just making sure I was clear. I was like, yeah, I think like 8-hour window is good. Now I'm going to sidebar a little bit. And obviously and I know you're not living under a rock down there in Florida, there's a lot of people doing GLP-1 receptor agonists, right? So your semaglutides and tirzepatides. Are you seeing people combine the use of those peptides and intermittent fasting, and because of that reduction in appetite, are you seeing a struggle with them actually getting enough calories if they try, even in an 8-hour window on a GLP-1 agonist, it may be tough to get all your calories in?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's a question that a number of people have approached me with, that idea of studying. Well, for people who say that fasting is difficult, what about using a GLP-1 to help them? And it very well could. And I think that's something we want to further explore. Your question is it leading people to not necessarily consume enough calories because they're just not hungry?
Right.
And I think that is a possibility, and that's something that much more research is needed to kind of better understand what's happening here. But it certainly seems like that's a big driver of the weight loss with these new drugs. When you keep appetite levels low, food intake.
And who knows what'll come of that research? It may say, well, if you're intermittent fasting for this period of time, maybe you don't need the GLP-1 agonist, or maybe you need a lower dose of it. So I think there's there's going to be some good information that comes out of that when those studies happen, because I think because it seems like a great combo. It's maybe easier to maintain that fasting window if you have something kind of keeping you full longer, increasing satiety, and, kind of slowing down gastric emptying. But I think the research may show that as we go forward. Now, I'm sorry, go ahead, Doc. You were about to say something.
I think you're right. For some people, it could be a great approach. What was occurring to me was, when we can help people become more metabolically flexible, meaning they can shift from utilizing glucose for energy during the feeding period to utilizing ketones for energy during the fasting period, it can produce many of the same benefits of not feeling so hungry while you're fasting. And they're kind of becoming adapted to fasting, such that you get this dual benefit, if you will. While you're fasting, you're using your own body fat for energy, but you're also not hungry, and it makes the fasting period a lot easier. But that takes a little bit of time to adapt to.
Good point there too, and we'll kind of talk about as we get into these longer periods. Like, you hit a really good point about, just like you wouldn't go run a marathon or run like this very long race and you've never done it, you're just going to hurt yourself, right? So it's a matter of it's almost like training for that, starting and then kind of building yourself up.
That's how I'd like to look at it, and because I think everybody, as stated earlier, does some form of fasting. Usually, almost none of us eat while we're sleeping, and we all have about an 8-hour period of not eating. So we think, oh, it's not that hard to fast for a longer period. And at first, it is, but after become adapted, it becomes a lot easier.
Yeah. Oh, I know, man. The first couple days when I've gotten into intermittent fasting, the first couple days, and I feel bad, man, because I was reading some of your articles, man, and just like, it's like, is this all in my mind? I'm angry, I'm irritable. And I'm like, wait a minute, my brain is not, this thing is designed to live a little bit longer without food. I think it's just that adaptation, like we just feel that way. But after a couple of days, you're kind of you don't notice it. It's kind of getting through that first couple of days of like, okay, I'm normally eating. Like, why is my stomach growling? Ignore that. Ignore that growling, right? To get
Yeah, our
there.
bodies are so adaptive, and they get used to what they get used to. So if you're
Mhm.
used to eating at a certain time in the morning, your stomach is almost going to tell you now it's time to eat. But as
Mhm.
you practice extending that time, over and over, it gets easier and easier. Just like exercising gets easier and easier the more frequently you do it.
Okay. So shifting into the next kind of mode of intermittent fasting and is 18:6, and it's only a 2-hour difference between that 16 hours and 8 because it doesn't seem like a lot. So with it only being 2 hours, where do you see the kind of the pros of that, the benefits of just extending that fast another couple of hours for most people?
Yeah, that's great. The pros, I think, is if your goal was a little bit more fat loss oriented and you're less concerned about maintaining lean tissue or growing larger muscles, the 18-6 would be the probably the approach that could really help, or 24 if you want to take it to the next level. But I think if the goal was again more fat loss, 18-6 would be the way to go. In addition, the longer periods of fasting have more benefits at the cellular level, so potentially greater levels of autophagy, greater improvements in mitochondria, perhaps greater cognitive focus, greater energy. And at the end of the day, you don't have to do one every day. It could be some days you feel better and able to fast longer, and other days you feel not as good fasting. And so it's okay, I think, to be a little flexible there.
Okay. Now, good segue there because we're going to talk about some of the longer fasts, but I think it's a good one because again, 16:8, 18:6 are in general a little bit more tolerable for most
Hmm.
people. And so you mentioned like feeling good. So, what are good signs of being in a healthy fasted state?
For me, I like to think of looking at my energy level. Do I feel energized? My focus. Do I feel like I can focus? Do I feel hungry, but not? Do I not feel like excessively hungry?
Mhm.
And if I have those three things, and um, I'm in a generally good mood while I'm fasting, then I would say those are good signs. And maybe the next one would be able to exercise without feeling too much pain, or it's not terribly difficult. Those would be signs that you're in a healthy fasted state to me.
Okay.
And if you're in that state, it feels actually quite good, and you might want to continue fasting. Yeah.
Okay. Gotcha. So on the flip side to that, what if you've kind of, I want to say overdone it, but because again, it seems like you're saying the benefits when you fast longer can be more, you're getting more autophagy, a little bit more ketone production, and shifting that metabolic or that metabolic switch, flipping the switch, so to speak. But it, how can the person tell if they're in like a hey, like maybe I need to eat? This is too far.
Yes.
This I'm in an unhealthy state of fasting. Like, is it the opposite of that, or there's some other things that the person should look out for?
In some ways, the opposite of that, but what I like to give you some concrete examples would be if you feel very irritable, lightheaded, headache, dizzy, extremely hungry. Any of those, I would say, there's no real purpose in extending the fast. Go ahead and just eat to start to feel a little better, and reevaluate maybe the next day what could be done. If your goal again is to fast for longer periods of time, what could be done to improve your experience? It could be that maybe maybe more water was needed, and ideally a little salt water could help. Could be that coffee, black coffee would be helpful. It just depends. There's so many factors to consider. I will say, just as a side note, it's as I'm talking, it's somewhat ironic that I'm the one talking about this, because for many years I was such a person who would crave to eat like as soon as I woke up. And so I think to myself, if I'm the one who now fasts regularly, most people can learn to adapt to it, because certainly nobody would have expected me to be the person fasting if you knew my younger self.
Yeah,
Yeah.
no, skipping breakfast. We're always told
Right.
breakfast is the most important meal of the day, right? It's like literally entire ad campaigns on eating first thing in the morning.
So
Yeah.
exactly. And I like to say, okay, two things. One, we all eat, quote, breakfast. It's just we eat breakfast at maybe a different hour.
Right.
And when you look at the words breakfast, what does it stand for?
You're breaking
Break
your fast, right?
fast.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
historically, breakfast is breaking the fast. And then the question is, how long is the fast? But yeah.
Okay. So good segue there, Dr. Anton. So now we've you worked our way up. We've done a 16-8, we've done an 18-6, and now another one that you mentioned was a 24 approach. So 20 hours of fasting, 4 hours of eating. So what are kind of the, obviously, is it just like, hey, I'm getting more autophagy, more ketones? Like, is there, you're just stretching it longer, seeing more benefits, or is there kind of like that break point where like, is there something special about that 20 number?
The exact hours is a question, but as you were talking, there is a phenomenon that I didn't mention yet, is that typically the longer we fast, the more growth hormone starts to be secreted. And it is possible, in addition to the other biological mechanisms, that, yeah, sure, longer fasting period could result in better cellular adaptations, more growth hormone, and then the shorter eating period, when you do consume food, your body would have a kind of a greater protein synthesis, utilize those calories for energy, and likely minimize the chance of fat gain, or fat storage, because you're burning in fat burning mode for so long. But the trick of that one is that now it's really a challenge probably to consume enough calories in that 4 hour period. It would either require two large meals, or what many people advocate, which would be the one meal a day approach, where you consume all your calories in one big meal. Yeah.
Which is a lot of food in that one
Which
meal
is a lot of
approach.
food. And
Wow. A lot. And so I guess that would be my only concern, especially if you're trying to maintain lean muscle mass, is shifting to that 4 hour eating window. It may be really difficult to just eat enough calories in there to maintain, especially if you're like, hey, I'm going to have one big meal at the start, one big meal at the end. It's a lot of food, man. It could take 45 minutes to eat. I've been there, some of the fasting I've done.
yeah, and I guess one other component of fasting that a lot of people don't talk about is time between meals too. And so if
Right.
you're now only within a 4 hour period and you just consumed one huge meal, and now you need to try to consume another huge meal within the next 3 hours, that can put some stress on the metabolic system itself. And so there's a kind of a pro con to that approach as well, when you think of it that way.
Okay.
Now, the one meal a day would overcome that potential limitation, but it would require consuming so much calories that you've consumed many calories as your body needs for all its functions and protein needs. And maybe that's possible for some people, but for a lot of people, it's challenging.
Could be. So would you say you're not the biggest fan of this one? Oh, is
Well,
this kind of
the way I would say it is, for most people, it's probably so difficult to sustain that I wouldn't recommend it as the first approach, myself
gotcha.
included. I don't do great on one meal a day, but I do have friends that really advocated and they love it for at least some sometimes in short periods of time, but some friends I've had that have done this for many years, and they seem to do great with it.
Okay. Great. I can tell you right now, I ain't doing it. It ain't happening. It ain't happening, man. I can do 16. You got me there. Once you go past 16, I'm like, you know what? This isn't right. What are we doing? What are we doing?
I think there's pros and cons, and I do
Yeah,
think
yeah.
meal size is also important, because if you consume too many calories at one time, that can result in high levels of postprandial glucose and
Hmm.
postprandial oxidative stress because of the amount of food consumed. So
Oh yeah, it's a
it's a
lot.
balance.
It really is. It really is.
Mhm.
So now, kind of getting, and we've got a couple more here because now I want to kind of get into some advanced graduate level fasting here. And so a
Okay.
couple, I doing a little research here, and reading some of your articles and some of your work. There is the 5-2.
Hmm.
So this is, I'm assuming you're eating for 5 days, normal calories, normal eating pattern, and then you're going to fast 2 consecutive days.
Well, it doesn't have to be consecutive days. It could
Okay,
be
gotcha.
non-consecutive days. It could be
Right.
3 days and then 1 day of fasting, and then 2 days of eating and 1 day of fasting.
Okay.
Or it could be 2 consecutive days. It just depends on the person's preference.
Mhm.
Um, that is an alternative approach that some people find helpful. Um, and generally speaking, that approach would be for reducing calorie intake, because on those fasting days, similar to alternate day fasting, you're just not eating calories for an entire day, or if you are, a very small amount, which is a modification. And because of that, that creates a pretty significant calorie deficit that's difficult to make up for with calories the next day or the next few days. And so as a result, you typically lose weight on those types of approaches.
Okay. So, assuming that, so if I'm hearing right, it's kind of like the longer that a person is fasting, they should start to experience more weight loss benefits in over time, as they're, kind of going through it. Because it's interesting enough, because if I'm hearing you right, it's like, okay, you're getting to longer fasting periods, you're shifting more into ketosis, you're burning more fat, you're getting more autophagy, we're going to talk all about longevity benefits as well. Um, and so it's just making sure in these periods of time, let's say, okay, I'm doing my 5-day eating window. Are they, here's a better question if I want to make sure I'm wording this right. So in those 5 days, is it your normal, is there an increased caloric intake to kind of compensate for the 2 days that you're fasting?
So most likely, yes, but the reality is that most people, at least with the alternate day eating approach, cannot compensate by eating enough to make up for the calorie deficit produced by fasting the day before. Now, with the 5-2 plan, with 5 days of eating and 2 days of fasting, it's a little bit easier to make up for it. But what the research we did showed was that in most cases with the 5-2 approach, there was significant weight loss. But the composition of the weight wasn't always body fat. It could also be lean tissue. And so it's the effects on the body composition are similar, I think, in many ways to the effects of calorie restriction.
Okay, gotcha. And the last one, the
Sure.
one where I think you got to be ready, you got to be a pro, is the 36-hour fast. So talk to us about that one.
Yeah. I think that one, like you said, no one would suggest doing that until you've kind of graduated to that level and have become what I consider fasted adapted, able to fast for 16, 18, 20 hours without too much difficulty. Because the 36 hour would require a couple nights of going to bed without consuming food, right? And so that's the next level. What why would you do such a thing? Maybe is the question. But I think it goes back to many of the cellular mechanisms we've talked about. But the one of the other great effects, if you can prolong the fast for that long, is that it can help to start to rebuild the immune system. Of course, if your goal is to maximize fat loss, for whatever reason, that would be an approach that could really help with that goal as well. And of course, from the point of view of elevating growth hormone, increasing neurogenesis in the brain, elevating ketone levels in the body, and all of the benefits that come with that, the 36-hour would be more powerful than the other approaches.
Okay. Just working your way up to that Jedi level of fasting
Yeah.
could be the challenge for most people. So thanks for taking us through those, because again, there's so many different ways to do it. Now, and again, I think for most people, I'm hearing correctly, it's a matter of starting slow. Even if you start at like a 12, feel comfortable, get to 14, get to 16. So it's a matter of kind of like continually pushing the limit. And it could just be a level of comfort. And also, from hearing you correctly, it's just don't feel like you have to be like, hey, set in stone, this is what I'm doing. There may be periods of time where you do longer fast, do shorter fast. Is it more of just listening to the body, listening to how the body responds? Um,
That's what I would recommend. And personally, that's what happened to me as I was studying fasting. I would kind of start to experiment a little bit with myself. And it was actually over the course of maybe 4 to 6 months before it became ingrained in my lifestyle. What I started noticing was on the days I fasted or prolonged the period of time of fasting before breakfast, I'd have more energy, feel more cognitively sharp, and then I'd eat, and then I'd feel a little bit more lethargic, and I was kind of intrigued by that. And so, to back to your question, yes, I would recommend everybody take their time. There's no rush to have to get to a certain number too quickly. Yeah.
good. What's your record? How long? What's your longest fast?
Oh, I'm actually not the longest faster in the world. Probably around 48 hours is my record. It's not a long one, Shane. So I can empathize with people who don't want to do 72 hours or anything like that.
Well, it's
So
impressive.
I'm not a record
Yeah.
faster, to
No,
be
no,
honest with
man,
you. I'm more of
it's
a
impressive.
daily, I'm more of a prolonged daily faster. Yeah.
No, man, I can only give myself so much hunger. It's like I got to get a little something here, but it's good.
Yeah.
Maybe I may push the limit a little bit here in the future, but I work my way up to it. So now here's the thing, and I know we've kind of mentioned the increase in growth hormone for prolonged fast. And if you've been around people in the bodybuilding world, the fitness community, there's this kind of concept of you need to eat every 2 to 3 hours. This is a standard bodybuilding 101. Eat every 2 hours. 6 meals a day. A lot of food,
Mhm.
right, over time. So that being said, one thing I've never heard in this world is, hey, you should do intermittent fasting to help with gaining muscle, lean muscle. So now we're going to kind of be very, I'm not going to say controversial. But now this is the cool part about it, because the question I want to ask you is, can you build muscle? Can you gain muscle while intermittent fasting?
The short answer is absolutely. The longer answer is you have to be really focused on the meals you're eating, the timing of your meals, making sure you're sleeping adequately, and all the other components are in place. Um, and then you're much more likely to actually gain lean, high quality muscle. And of course, the biggest driver of that is going to be the exercise program that you're on. But if you're doing a high intensity resistance exercise program, there's no doubt that you can still gain muscle, if not more muscle, while practicing intermittent fasting or time restricted eating.
Okay.
Now, if your goal was simply to gain as much weight as possible and bulk up, this is not the approach I would recommend. But if your goal is to gain lean muscle, absolutely.
So there's a concept in sports performance of the anabolic windows. And so it's like, hey, after you lift weights, there's a certain period of time where you should be consuming protein, carbs, fat, all of that. How do we kind of time or kind of really adjust the anabolic window when someone's in an intermittent fasting protocol?
So in the book that I helped co-author called The Man Diet, we talk a little bit about this. And with time restricted eating, let's say you exercise in the afternoon, which many people do. I like to think of there being potentially two anabolic windows. The first would be when you break your fast, because when you fasted for, let's say, 16 hours, your body's in a state where it's going to convert the food you consumed into energy, muscle repair. You've now potentially elevated growth hormones, and at the cellular level, you're ready to take in this protein and convert it into tissue growth. Now, so that's the first potential anabolic window. And then the second would be after exercising. We all talk about this anabolic window. There's some controversy if it's really 30 to 45 minutes or if it's just the next time you eat. But personally, I can say that I do experience increased hunger within about 30 minutes of a pretty high intensity workout. So I think there's something there. If you're somebody who exercises in the morning and in the fasted state, like I've started to do more often, well, then the next anabolic window you would have kind of like a supercharged anabolic window because you've now paired fasting plus exercise. And that would be a great time to make sure you get the good quality protein and other macronutrients.
Good. That was exactly what I was going to ask you. What about the
Oh, cool.
morning workout people if they're running a risk of kind of losing, that we're missing that window because you're not eating within a certain time after working out?
They're both great. There's no wrong time to exercise, and you get a supercharged window or you potentially get 2 anabolic windows. Yeah.
So you mentioned something earlier, and I want to circle back to was ketones and getting to ketosis, right? And so is there a role of ketones in muscle building in that fasted state or while you're intermittent fasting?
I think there's an important role in muscle preservation because if you're able to switch fuel sources from glucose to ketones, now your body's using ketones ideally derived from your body fat for energy instead of lean tissue to produce energy. And so when you're using ketones from your own body, you're preserving the muscle tissue. And at the same time, the ketones have the potential to put yourself into a state where when you do, like we've said before, they help to activate autophagy, which helps to clear out the cells, which then allows when your cells to be more responsive to nutrients when they do come in the system.
Okay, perfect. Now, great segue because I'm glad you said that because again, if we're trying to use our body or have our body use its own ketones to preserve muscle, using it as an energy source, there's a lot of exogenous ketone supplements out there, right? So you got sometimes they're in cans, they're in little shot bottles. I mean, there's powders. I've seen a lot of different things here. So what are your thoughts on using exogenous ketones in this process?
So I think they can be helpful in many ways, but I want to distinguish that from the fasted state because the fasted state is producing ketones endogenously from your own body fat with the metabolic switch. But ketones themselves are powerful signaling molecules. And so if you're obtaining them from an exogenous source, you're still getting many of the benefits of the ketones. However, I would lean towards not taking them while fasting so that you don't shut down the mechanisms of fat burning, ketone production while fasting. But if you wanted to take them, for example, before a workout or while working out like I do, I think that could be beneficial. The body has an amazing ability to kind of determine which fuel source to use at which moment. And so I definitely don't feel negative about them. I just wouldn't necessarily take them while fasting unless your goal was to really fast for even longer and they helped you fast longer. Yeah.
Okay. So now you're a morning workout fasted person now.
It depends. I kind of alternate a little bit, but yeah, on a good day, I like to get a morning workout in.
Okay. Same here. And I've been trying to play around with some ketone supplements a little bit. And so from hearing you right, if I'm in a fasted state and I'm going to work out in the morning, is that a good time to take them, right? Because now it's okay, I'm about to have this hour workout. I know I haven't eaten. I know I'm there, but like it's going to be a hard workout. Is there some benefit to using it then? Or would you say, hey, just wait up, just hold off on that and focus on that like later in the day?
So I think that's a really great question. And I think it's a judgment call. It could be a good time to take them. If you find that taking them allows you to work out better for longer, and you feel stronger while you're working out, then yeah, it's probably a good time to take them, because the benefits of that workout would be worth it. If your goal was purely from a fat loss standpoint and you really wanted to make sure you're tapping into your own body fat, then I would advise probably not to take them, and you take them later in the day and really maximize the fat loss from the workout. Um, so it just depends on you if it's a performance goal versus a fat loss goal.
Perfect. Perfect. All right. So now, when I was kind of preparing our outline, I had like this long list, but I feel like a lot of the things, now that we're talking, like a lot of those questions all kind of revolve around the same concept. And I think it's a good time to
Sure.
kind of shift into that is if I'm hearing you right, there's a lot of the benefits you're getting from fasting really kind of come down to that about, the body's ability to shift into that state where we're in autophagy, where you're clearing out old cells, you're activating autophagy genes and these great processes happening here. So I want to kind of shift to longevity a little bit, because I think when it comes to, and I'm big into the hallmarks of aging, and so many of
Mhm.
them really revolve around inflammation. And I think inflammation is, to me, the biggest driver of hallmarks of aging, because I feel like it's a perfect circle. It causes it, and it's a consequence of aging, right? So that being said, let's shift into talking about how autophagy is. Sorry, let me say it again. How intermittent fasting is can be crucial in the longevity. If your goal is longevity.
All right, sure.
I know. Can I word that a little different? I know
No,
I just gave you like 70 questions in one sentence. Let's try this a different way here. So let me do this a different way. And that's to kind of simplify the question. Let's talk about the link between intermittent fasting and longevity. I think that's a little bit better.
sure. Well, and that what comes to my mind, which you may have had somebody on your um, podcast previously talk about. I'm trying to remember the first author's name, but basically they did a study with rodents, male rodents, where they were one of three conditions where it was normal calories, same amount of calories, same type of calories, but it practiced time restricted eating, or a third condition with calorie restriction plus time restricted eating. And what they found was the rodents who practiced time restricted eating and consumed the exact same calories and same macronutrients as the ones who um, ate ad libitum, meaning whenever they wanted, lived 11% longer, and they were healthier. They were healthy while they were living longer. Now, the rodents who consumed fewer calories and also practiced more extended fasting, which is really important. It wasn't just fewer calories, it's also extended fasting, lived even longer, 20% longer. And so that study to me said a lot of things, that it wasn't just calorie restriction, but it was this period of time of not eating that resulted in this extended longevity and healthy longevity. Now, the question I think you're getting at, okay, great. Now, why? Why does that happen? So many factors, so many biological mechanisms are activated by prolonged fasting, similar to exercise. And to identify just one is kind of difficult. But as we've alluded to, it at the cellular level, we're talking about stimulating autophagy, reducing inflammation, reducing oxidative stress, improving mitochondrial function, clearing out senescent cells, enhancing stem cell production, improving growth hormone production, enhancing brain-derived neurotropic hormone. And all of these put yourself in this healthier state, that when your cells are functioning in a healthier state and your body's experiencing less oxidative stress, and you're running off a cleaner energy source, it's no wonder that you're going to live longer for a better period of time.
No, that's amazing. That hits all those markers though. So I think there's benefit to kind of incorporating intermittent fasting. And again, like you said, man, you don't have to do it 365 days a year, right? So at least a few times a year incorporating. I think there's some balance there.
I'm really glad you said that, because for me, it's nice to be flexible and not feel like you just have to be perfect when you fast. And it's nice to know that one day you may go off that eating window, and it's okay. You can get back on it the next day. And in some ways, I don't necessarily encourage it all the time, but in some ways it's good, because your body needs challenges, and it doesn't always want to be given the same stimulus to adapt to. And one biological process that I didn't even mention, which is possibly my favorite, I can't believe I haven't mentioned it yet, is called hormesis. Do you talk about hormesis much in your podcast?
Usually when I'm talking about methylene blue, I don't know if you're
All
familiar with
right.
methylene blue because
Okay,
I'm like,
yeah,
hey,
I
well, it's like,
am.
yeah, well, it's like,
But
like, hey, at small doses, great, but it's in many ways we think about like, and I don't know if you're familiar, now I'm circling my brain. And sometimes I talk about homeopathy too, where I don't know if you're familiar with that. Homeopathy is kind of a naturopathic thing, but it's like it's like, oh boy, if I go down this path, man, it's gonna be a whole other podcast. But sometimes like cures like, but also it's using such a small amount of something. Like one of the homeopathic treatments is arsenicum, which is arsenic, right? So, but again, it's such a minuscule microscopic amount. It's not going to cause any negative reaction in the body, but it has some potential health benefits. I know that's a whole other thing there, but getting back to methylene blue, when you're doing methylene blue at very low doses, you can see some of the mitochondrial function improvements, some of the oxidative stress reduction. But as you get into these higher doses, it can be harmful.
that's the fundamental principle underlying hormesis. And the idea is that intermittent fasting, you want to create a mild to moderate amount of stress. You don't want extreme stress, and because extreme can cause too much damage, and then followed by recovery. And so the same principle that applies to methylene blue can apply to fasting, can apply to exercise. Most people can wrap their brain around the exercise the easiest, because we all know if we overdo it, how that might feel. And we also know that if we don't do too much or not enough, we don't really get the adaptation that's needed to grow stronger muscles or develop better cardiovascular health. And so this, at the cellular level though, we need that stress, the temporary stress, to stimulate the process of hormesis so that our cells can become more adaptive. Yeah.
Awesome. We're almost done, man. So we're
Sure.
still in the fast. We're still
All right.
we're still in our fast here. Let's talk about coffee and fasting. Because again, you kind of mentioned earlier about a dry fast and kind of I don't know if there's such a wet fast, but obviously be able to drink, able to drink water, which is great. I would hope we would do that. So when it comes down to it, with coffee, here's the basic question. And I know sometimes we'll get that when people ask me when I recommend intermittent fasting to my patients is, can I drink coffee while I'm fasting?
So my answer, and some people may have a different answer. I think the answer is yes. Especially if it's black coffee, and the amount of calories is so minuscule in black coffee, and if anything, it can help accelerate fat oxidation or amplify fat oxidation, which can help with the metabolic switch. And so I find, and many people that I've talked to say it helps with fasting while you're fasting. Now, if you pure technical, some people would say water only, which I also can understand. Now, it depends on your personality and how strict you want to be, but my personality is one that coffee would be just fine. And for the longest time, while I was adapting to fasting, I had coffee with a little bit of cream and milk, which some people would feel aghast by. It's interesting because now I don't even want that, because I can feel the shift if I have even just a little bit of milk while I'm fasting. So my recommendation would be to move towards the black coffee or water if you don't like black coffee.
Great. And so interesting, because I know we mentioned the autophagy thing, which is an amazing, obviously your body's killing all the cells, and there are some studies that show that coffee can actually help stimulate autophagy. But
True.
I believe it's via the chlorogenic acid that's in the coffee.
Yeah.
But you mentioned black coffee, but I saw another study that shows like the darker the roast is, the more roasted the bean is. It's like the opposite effect. You can actually reduce autophagy. It can become, I don't say harmful, but it actually reduces the chlorogenic acid. So you're not getting those benefits from it. So, that being said, it's, I feel like at the end of the day, it's like, hey, if you're going to drink, this is where I'm going with this, is like, hey, I want you to drink black coffee, but should it just not, maybe a medium roast or a light roast, and not getting to the darker. So basically get out of Starbucks is where I'm going. They roast the
Well,
living. shit out of their beans in there sometimes, man.
Yeah, this could take us down a rabbit hole. What I would just say is if you can try to choose organic coffee beans so that you minimize pesticides. Now, the dark roast versus light roast versus medium roast, that's an interesting point, and maybe there is some truth to it, but I think all coffee beans have still some chlorogenic acids in them. So it comes back to, okay, what will you do consistently? If you will drink dark roast and that's your strong preference, then my opinion is that's okay. If you don't have much of a preference, then maybe lean towards the light or medium roast. Yeah.
Okay. I'm pretty sure I won't be allowed back in Starbucks now after that.
Well,
thankfully, it's a relatively small time podcast here. I can get away with things for now.
There you go.
All right. So let's break this fast, man. So we're ready we've done our 16 hours of 18 hours. It's time to eat get some food in our bodies here, man. What are how do you break a fast? I mean, with that being, when I'm going with this is like, hey, I just finished fasting. Let me just go in and eat all the food, or is there a kind of a smart way to do it, whether you're doing a short-term fast or a longer-term fast?
So I think for the short-term fast, like 16 hours or 18 hours or anything that's within a day, there really doesn't need to be too much concern about how you break the fast, because that's almost like we all eat. I think in today's day and age, we've just become so accustomed to eating so frequently that the idea of actually not eating for 16 hours sounds, wild, but it's really not that long of a period in the context of our ancestors. And so I don't necessarily think you have to be too concerned about breaking that type of fast. Now, and to answer your question directly, I think you can just go to eating whatever your preference is. Sometimes I want to eat breakfast, an omelet or some sort, and sometimes I'm just in the mood for moving towards lunch, and it just depends on my mood and day, and there's no real concern about what I eat at that moment. Now, if it was a much longer fast, and probably it's only starts to be concern after 48 or 72 hours, maybe it would be easier on the stomach to introduce lighter foods like fruit, or as a initial way to break the fast, to kind of reorient the body to. But this is not my specialty. I'm just suggesting that it's not something we need to worry about for short-term fast. Longer fast is a different story, potentially.
Right.
Potentially.
Good. And that's good for people to know. So it's like, hey, don't feel like, hey, I just did my fast. I need to eat 70 grams of protein on that first meal to kind of maximize my anabolic window, anything like that. So I think there's discretion, the better part of valor when it comes to breaking the fast here.
You don't have to at all. You might find that you can eat more, understandably. And I don't think you have to be too concerned about eating more, as long as you're practicing the time restricted eating and your calories are whole foods and not, quote, junk food.
Okay, great. And I think that it's like, for me, I would think if I'm counseling a patient, just like, hey, I want to get in fasting. And again, I'm not a nutritionist, we learn quite a bit of clinical nutrition in our program, but I'm not the person that's going to be like, eat this many, I'm not going to do your macros for you. That's just not what I do, right? But I can kind of give you guidance on, I'm more of like, hey, if you have diabetes, this is how I want you to eat. If you have high blood pressure, this is how I want you to eat, but more specifically, not so much. But I do try to tell people that when you come out of that fast, not to be excessive, right? Because again, I just feel like it's almost like, I kind of relate this to when someone's losing weight and we do some work with the GLP-1s here. I don't want that person losing weight too fast, right? Because most people, when they are overweight, and those fat cells are basically storage banks of toxins. And so if I'm like, all right, let's do this, you're going to lose 20 pounds in a month, they may feel like crap, because as those toxins are released into the bloodstream from the fat cell, and I kind of have that analogy when you're breaking a fast, or it's like, hey, I don't think you should go have 8 pancakes and 14 eggs and all that, because that's a lot of nutrients, man, to flood the bloodstream with, right? And that can lead to those spikes in glucose and insulin.
Yeah, I agree. agree. But I wouldn't recommend anybody go eat that way, not breaking a fast or breaking a fast. Yeah.
Right. No, of course, but it just says a concept of like
Mhm.
overdoing it because again, it's too much of a good thing, right? This goes back to the hormesis thing, like where like I'm going to eat enough to be healthy, but if I do overdo it, you could be actually increasing inflammation because you're just it's the system is overtaxed, right? So I think there's some being smart about it, how you come out of the fast and not overdoing it, right?
Absolutely.
Indeed, indeed. So almost there, man. We fasted, we broke it, we got some food here. So I really want to think about the let you out of here, man. This is a chance to do some myth busting on intermittent
Yeah,
fasting here.
sure.
So what are the most common myths and misconceptions of intermittent fasting that you encounter or have encountered?
Hmm. Well, I think one would be that it leads to muscle loss. Um, and I think we talked pretty extensively about that. It doesn't have to. It could if you don't consume enough calories while you're eating. Um, what else? That it's not natural, maybe, for thousands of years as humans, this is how we
Right.
survived and lived, and so I think we're predisposed, or our our bodies are meant to experience periods of fasting followed by periods of fast and feast and famine. In some ways was how we survived for so long. And I hesitated to use the word feast because I don't want to give the wrong message, but that's truly what our ancestors lived by. um, I'm not sure, but there are other myths that you've heard that you want me to talk about.
Yeah, I mean, I've heard, just sometimes people feel like when they don't eat, their metabolism slows down.
Mm,
So it's like, hey, because it's whole concept like, hey, if you don't eat enough calories, your body adapts to that. Now your metabolism slows down. So when you start eating again, you gain weight after you've been calorie restricted for so long. And I think
right.
people have this misconception of like, hey, if you're intermittent fasting, when you stop it, the weight's going to come back because now you're kind of eating back to normal, so to speak. And I don't think that's how that works. Yeah.
That's very much correct in most cases. Just to dive back for a second about calorie restriction, and one of the downsides about the calorie restriction approach to weight loss and weight maintenance is that when you lose weight with calorie restriction, you lose both fat mass and fat free mass, and that the fat free mass is what's the primary driver of our metabolic rate. And because of that, there is a loss of um, calories burned, your energy expenditure.
Mhm.
And so your metabolism actually does slow down a bit with calorie restriction. And it actually slows down more than you would anticipate from the loss of lean tissue. With intermittent fasting or with time restricted eating, we don't see that typically because lean mass is typically maintained. And again, that's the main driver of your metabolic rate. And so when you keep your lean tissue functioning well, in addition, so your metabolism actually doesn't go down, but in addition, it may even go up a little bit, not not so much that we should get too excited, but enough that it's definitely not going down. And the reason it might go up a little bit is because the process of converting our own body fat into ketones for energy does actually require some energy, which means our um, metabolic rate is a little bit elevated as a result of the fasting period.
Which makes sense because again, and also, especially if you're doing a 16/8 or 18/6, it's not like you're kind of coming in and out of it quick enough where I don't think it's really going to it's not going to shift the balance too far. Whether someone's eating 1,000 calories a day for 3 months and then they want to go back to eating 1,800 calories, then that could lead to that shift right there.
Right.
Um, and then another one is there's a difference in the response that I've heard a myth between the response between men and women in intermittent fasting.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Any
That
thoughts on that one?
is a great question. And what I'll say is, I don't know that there's any clear evidence that there's a difference in the response. I have heard from some women that it's harder to fast for longer periods and from some men that it's easier. having said that, I've also heard from some women that fasting works great for them. So I don't think that there's necessarily a clear indication that it works differently. And now this opens up it's a little bit trickier during before menopause for women, I think, because of the hormonal fluctuations and how that can influence appetite. But I think postmenopausal women in particular would not have any more difficulty than men. Yeah.
Yeah. So, I graduated undergrad from UIC, University of Illinois Chicago, the true Harvard of the Midwest. I don't care what Northwestern says. But, so there was a study that came out a couple of years ago about how intermittent fasting or time restricted eating affected female hormones. And the only one, and again, I got to look at if there's any updates to it, but I think the only one that it showed was DHEA, which is an adrenal hormone that helps produce, androgens in the body. It showed a slight decrease in that. Again, this was premenopausal, right? And so there was looked at that, but it didn't really show much of a change in estrogen, progesterone, and SHBG or sex hormone binding globulin. So I want to look into that a little bit further, but that may be one that's a little bit more research is needed to warrant that. But also, and making sure people get enough. I think if you're getting enough calories, that's a big part of it as well. And make sure you're doing all the other kind of longevity and optimization things that can help. But I do think that if that could be a concern if someone's already kind of coming into the clinic low in DHEA, they're under adrenal stress or adrenal fatigue, and now I'm going to do intermittent fasting, potentially make that worse. I think that's where it may take a little bit of maybe not doing the longer intermittent fasting, maybe shortening that time window up could be beneficial. But again, that's going to be a case by case kind of thing. But
it makes sense.
Food for thought, a little pun in our little fasting episode here, with that. All right, man. So this has been great.
Awesome.
I really appreciate you making time for this, and hopefully those listening have learned a lot more about intermittent fasting and how it could benefit longevity and athletic performance or muscle building and brain function and decreasing inflammation. And man, we didn't really dive into brain health that much, but we kind of did when we talked about autophagy and decreasing inflammation and all these great things. So
the one thing I'll say is, the ketones that we kind of mentioned a few times can be utilized, are not just can be, but are utilized by the brain in cases of where glucose is lowered. When glucose is reduced and ketones become available, they're actually the preferred source of fuel for the brain. And in cases of dementia where glucose levels are not ideal in the brain, or the ability to utilize glucose is compromised, ketones can be a great source of an alternative fuel for individuals who are experiencing cognitive challenges. And so lots to think about there.
I know we can do a whole other podcast on ketones and ketosis, man. So I would definitely love to have you back sometime in the future to talk about that. Because that's another fascinating subject. And there's been, obviously the ketogenic diet and I don't even want to open that can of worms right now. And what's the best way to do that? But man, Dr. Anton, thanks again. So for those listening, and we're going to put a lot of your information on how to follow you and your research and all that. But for now, how can people find you and learn more about what you got going on down there?
Sure. So I have a website, which is just my name, stevenanton.com. And then I'm on Instagram. I think it's at Dr. Anton or something like that. And then I'm also on LinkedIn as well. And soon to be on YouTube a little bit more.
You got to get out there. You do something. Well, this will be on YouTube. So this is your your foray into YouTube right there.
There you go.
So,
great.
Hey, man, thanks again for your time. We appreciate you. So this has been another episode of the Dr. Greg Jones Optimization Academy. We want to thank you all for listening and tuning in, and we will see you next time.